guys, welcome back to our second episode of the Keep It a Buck podcast. This episode is not our economics roundtable, it's going to be a little bit different. We're calling it a deep dive into China, GDP, and some other metrics that we're going to walk you through. So Dave, got us started with the global outlook on GDP and some rankings that you've been looking into.
First place, we have the United States, followed very closely by China, then Japan, Germany, India, and the United Kingdom. The most interesting bit is probably that all of these countries have some relation to the United Kingdom,
Right.
Whether or not they were colonized previously, geographically they're closely located, so they have that attachment in terms of GDP. That covers the United States, Germany, India, and the United Kingdom itself, obviously. China and Japan stand out here. Japan, the reason that their GDP started growing so exponentially was arguably because of a huge investment in education and around the 1700s. So that explains that. They were translating a lot of different texts from English into what they could understand, made a lot of advancements in engineering.
Human capital improvements, so to
Exactly.
speak.
China is really kind of a question mark here. How did China come to this influence? Population, obviously we understand, but there has to be something behind that.
Right, so I guess this kind of brings us to some research that we did, or just looked into some different scholarly papers. And what we did find is there is a little bit of controversy about how accurate is China's GDP really. Because if you look into it, there are a lot of theories that say this could be a very overinflated metric. Dave, I know you found an article from Luis Martinez from the University of Chicago where he kind of went into nightlights. Can you tell us a little bit about what that study kind of described?
For sure. So interestingly enough, China's figures can't really be validated outside of what they're giving us, so we sort of have to use abnormal methods. So what Luis Martinez did is he went into different satellite images. I think he compared around 100 different countries.
Right.
And he found that as their GDP grew, so did the amount of lights that were turned on at night, which makes sense. You know, factories are running, population's growing, all these different indicators of growth.
And it's interesting, maybe we could throw up a picture for everyone at home, but if you look at, like, from an outside perspective of the globe, and you look at South Korea, North Korea at night, there's complete darkness, you can't see anything. South Korea, you still see the light. So it's definitely indicative of the kind of economic activity that's going on. Because, you know, as you mentioned, if you're a country with a very strong economy, you're still going to have these factories open, you're still going to have people working. But yeah, keep going with the study.
Exactly. So essentially what he found was not only that there was a correlation between GDP and night light activity, but also between democratic and autocratic regimes.
Right.
So when we look at the United States, for example, they have a lower slope, and autocratic regimes such as China have a much steeper slope. And what he found, the disparity actually, I think he gave a little interview at the University of Chicago here. He said governments of all types, no matter how democratic or non-democratic they are, have an incentive to make their economies seem healthier than they actually are.
Makes
In a
sense.
democratic regime, there's a set of institutions that keep this temptation in check, a free press and independent legislative branch. And he goes on to say that autocracies overstate their GDP by 35%.
Right. And this is interesting, and you know, we can actually a little bit personally understand this because our parents did come from the former Soviet Union. And when you're running that kind of regime, I mean, in both of those countries, you could call it a communist-style regime. The issue is, for the government, they need to make sure that people are kind of blinded by these numbers and they don't think too much about, is all of this really working? And we know for sure that this was going on in the Soviet Union, so it does make sense that something like this would happen in China, where they would kind of overinflate these metrics and make them prop themselves up a little bit bigger on the global scale, because really it is difficult to measure. And this could even go as, you know, local as regional style governments, rather than just, you know, the whole country of China just takes all these numbers and just prop them up higher, because I have done a little bit of my own research, and I found that there are a lot of incentives for, you know, regional parts of China to have higher GDPs. And if the leaders of these regions, you know, report slower growth, that could pose, you know, big problems for them. They might not retain their position. So that's interesting.
So the GDP calculations, they take their different regions and then they combine them.
That's how I understand it, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Interesting. And also another thing is that if you look at a lot of the growth that China has experienced since probably around the 1980s until now, they've been spawning very large cities. And the makeup of their GDP, basically like the breakdown of which industries go into it, is very largely industrial. whether they're manufacturing goods or construction, just areas like that. You see huge 20 million person cities coming up, roads, roadways, things like that. And that's what's really been feeding into their GDP. It's a lot of stuff that you can see. Whereas on the other hand, if we take, let's say the number one player right now, right, the United States,
Right.
the majority of their GDP is service-based. So it's not really things that are tangible, but it's more value they're providing. Like, for example, Adobe, right? If we're working with Adobe, that's a software as a service. So it's not a physical good. It's not something you can see. It's more so intellectual.
Right, and you know, just to kind of follow up on that, China, because of that, is in a current account surplus, which, if you guys don't know what that means, is basically what David is saying. It's kind of they have a lot of exports going on, but when it comes to actual investments into their own financial assets, I don't know about in the past, but I know recently, international companies have been struggling, and investors in China, and they've been struggling to draw investment bonds and investing into the economy of China. Which is interesting to think about. I wonder what that will bode for the future if less businesses will want to even set up shop in China. You know, how will it affect these numbers? Because just to follow up as well, China actually this past year but between 1992 and 2008, the real value, if we're accounting for kind of them inflating their numbers and doubling up on what we were talking about with the nightlights, it would probably look more like about 4.9% per year of growth.
Yearly growth.
Yeah, yearly growth, rather than about 6.3%, which was reported. So, these are all interesting things to think about. How worried do you think the U.S. actually should be about China and it kind of trailing us in terms of GDP?
I think what China should be worried about is their foreign assets, right, that they're holding in different countries. Because, let's say something comes up in their future, like take Taiwan for example,
Yeah.
right? If there's conflict within Taiwan and America says that they want to impose sanctions on China, a lot of, and I know you were speaking about this earlier with me, a lot of real estate that China owns in
Right.
terms of their foreign assets is in the United States.
It is.
So if things go south of Taiwan, America can very easily restrict those assets. So I think it's more of a concern for China.
That is a big concern, and not only that, but let's say China does invade Taiwan. As we saw with Russia invading Ukraine, for example, like McDonald's pulled out of Russia, a lot of these different companies might not want to associate themselves with China anymore. And I know at one point for sure, multinational companies actually employed about 16 billion people in China, and they accounted for more than half of their exports. Which, when you think about it, if you start building a lot of controversy around what's going on there, it would be really bad for business for them. But yeah, in terms of real estate, China actually doesn't own too much of real estate in the United States. I know it's still a substantial amount, but Bill Gates owns almost as much agriculture in the U.S. as China, and he owns about 250,000 acres.
Whoa.
So this is something to create some perspective. But yeah, the U.S. is definitely starting to pick up on what's going on there, and there are a lot of bills in the works. So I know DeSantis in Florida is working on passing a bill to restrict Chinese nationals from purchasing land in Florida, which is something to think about. South Carolina is doing something like this. Texas is doing something like this. And I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see at the federal level some kinds of policy related to restricting Chinese nationals from buying, big parts of land, or maybe specifically agriculture land in the U.S.
Well, that's not a good sign, is it? I mean, that's kind of like showing fear towards China. Why don't we want them buying land then?
The issue with them buying land, it's almost the same issue as, what's been going on with TikTok, where everyone is concerned about them spying on us. A lot of this land is close to U.S. military bases, and the U.S. is concerned to give China that much influence, and, especially with the spy balloon situation that was going on recently, there is a building fear of China, and, especially if this land is being purchased by large companies from China, this, is something to look out for. And, as we were talking about before, China does kind of have a hand in all of or like a lot of the big businesses that are founded there or led by Chinese citizens.
I mean, kind of what I'm wondering is what's the purpose of China holding so many foreign assets? Because they believe I think they're either in the top 5 or the first largest in terms of different foreign assets.
Right.
So I guess it looks like there's not a lot of local investment opportunities for them to multiply. I know they had something with their intellectual property. They had a lot of intellectual property cases. So basically when a business goes in there, they sort of lose all rights to what they're making.
And this is something similar that happens in Russia as well, where Russia, has a lot of knockoff products of products that are popular in the U.S. and in other countries. So this isn't something that's unique to China, but I think it does make sense. I mean, think about it. If you're a business owner in China, like this isn't the Chinese government buying land. This is like business owners or like citizens. Why would you prefer to keep your money in China rather than a free market economy like the U.S. where that money could compound and work for you better?
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, it definitely makes, especially as a private citizen, but it's interesting, these people that are foreign investors, they still choose to live in China. So they're not moving to America and being employed in America, right? From what I'm understanding.
And I think that China wouldn't even allow it. Like, you take like Jack Ma, right? Founder of Alibaba.
Right.
He wouldn't be allowed to come live in the U.S. and just leave all his money behind in China. I'm pretty sure that they actually have laws surrounding it, how much money can be withdrawn from China every year. Because a lot of the business owners there, they don't want to keep their money in China. They want it, it's very restricted there. They would rather keep their money here and park it in various assets in the U.S. or in other countries. But I don't remember the exact number, but I do know that there is a restriction on how much they can take out.
Interesting. I wonder how America's going to act in relation to Taiwan, right? Considering that tensions are mounting there.
And we did kind of set precedent with what's been going on with Russia and Ukraine. So it should be some kind of similar response. Probably we would see some kind of asset freezing.
With the sanctions.
Right.
I mean, personally, I think that if, like, let's say China does go into Taiwan, considering the assets that internationally, I don't even want to say that we have, but just international assets that Taiwan does have in terms of semiconductor manufacturing, I think America would rather obliterate Taiwan or just remove that factory rather than let China have it.
Right. I mean, you don't think that would be a controversial decision to make?
I mean, it'd be controversial, and again, when I say it, doesn't mean like literally just like erase the factory. I just think that if China were to have their hands on a fabrication plant like that, that gives them, number one, immense military prowess. Think of how they can innovate their weapons. Not just the physical factory, but the engineers that work there, just the whole structure there, and they would just have a huge leg up in terms of chip manufacturing. Because if we look just going like a few years back, America had the leg up on China because chips were developed in America and outsourced to Asia for production.
Right.
But now a lot of the intellect, the people who are designing these chips, they live in Taiwan, they live in China. So I think that it would be a huge issue with America. Obviously, they would try to stop it with sanctions, but I think if it got to China getting their hands on TSMC, I think that America would intervene militarily.
I mean, yeah, that's definitely interesting. That seems like something that we could definitely see come up. My question for you is, where do you see the future of our relationship with China? Like, it seems as though things are getting more tense and tensions are rising, so to speak, like every year. So how do you see, do you see this, just we need this relationship to continue, so we're going to try to keep things from reaching that boiling point? Or how do you see things proceeding?
I think a cautious partnership is the way to describe it. There's definitely assets on both sides, but I think both nations look at each other very cautiously. Like you were saying, how America doesn't really want Chinese businesses and individuals buying land, even though it's still happening. It's not a full restraint. In the same way that China's very they understand that America wants the assets in Taiwan, right? That's the whole reason there's a conflict there. Right. So again, I don't think that we'll ever, just because the mentalities are so different between the two countries, the people are so different, our goals are so different. But I think that especially living in America, how much do we see on American media of afraid of TikTok, Chinese spy balloon,
And I mean, even during let's say Donald Trump's presidency, was a huge talking point of his to renegotiate all of our trade agreements and stop this kind of deficit that we're in with them.
Yeah. I mean, again, so moving into the future, I think that there's benefit to be had from some sort of partnership.
Of course.
I can't see it happening, especially as we spoke about earlier when we discussed BRICS.
Right.
China and Russia are becoming sort of partners by circumstance.
And I mean, I was honestly surprised that India is also in that partnership, considering their relationship with China. Like, it doesn't seem like they want anything to do with them either. So yeah, that's interesting. And something else that I found, which is actually somewhat related, I guess, since we're already on the topic of BRICS, is China has actually been getting very strong in terms of AI technology. And
Really?
yes, they have, because as you know, in China, like the way that they treat their citizens, they're constantly watching and they're monitoring what everyone does. So they've developed really advanced facial recognition technology. And it's interesting because now that they're going to start, selling these new frontier technologies, there's actually disproportionately more buyers that come from weak democracies and autocracies. So this will be interesting to see as it progresses.
Okay, I see what you're saying there. So that the technology that they're developing to enforce on their citizens,
Right.
it makes sense for countries with similar mindsets to purchase technology like that.
Yeah, exactly. So that will definitely be something to look out for as we start to consider, the expansion of new technologies and how that might start to influence lifestyles in different countries.
Of course, because I mean, America won't be buying up things like that. That'll raise a lot of questions. Yeah, I guess we'll have to see where it goes. That's all we have for you guys today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with you next week.
Yep, and same thing, subscribe. New podcasts will be, twice a week?
Twice a week.
For the time being. Maybe we'll bump that up to 3 times in the summer. We'll keep you posted. But yeah, as David said, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.